Welcome. I'm Rob Straw. I'm the CEO of CEIBS Zurich campus in Zurich. Working from home today because of the COVID restrictions we have for working on campus. I'll be your moderator today. Welcome to the CEIBS Lessons for Leaders webinar today on the topic of COVID-19 impact on the workplace 1 year in versus 5 years out. The topic has been talked about ad nauseum, it seems like, over the last year. There's a lot of webinars, a lot of talking, a lot of research at the company level, at the research level. Yet it seems like every day we're still overwhelmed with what this means. Just this morning, my team and I were working on one of our deans coming over to Europe for a couple months. And just to travel between the countries is still an absolute disaster. It's very complex. We're even saying don't go to country X and go to Y, much less the work thing. We recently had just last week, our first face-to-face event back on campus. We didn't know how to do it. 18 months in, and we still don't know how to do this. The work is changing, the workplace is changing, and the workers are changing, mindset, and all of this put together. There's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of speculation, there's very few answers out there, but there's a lot of questions. Where are we going to be in 5 years? A lot of that is a crystal ball. Some of that today we can talk about, but 5 years out. Our two expert speakers are going to provide us with some education around this, about their findings from research and research-based insights. That's what we do at CEIBS. It helps us visualize what the workplace, what work, and what workforce and the location might look like in the future. After our two speakers, I'm going to introduce them in just a second. We typically have two experience sharers. Today we have Bruno Casemiro. He's a leadership development at UBS, and Tina Liu. She's a graduate of our Gimba program from the class of 2015. She's the HR director for Pierre Fabre in Shanghai. They're both on the ground running organizations and working on these topics on the ground in their organizations. And we'll be asking them to share some of their real life experiences based on the inputs from both Professor Zhao and Aidan, who I would like to introduce you now. Before I do introduce you, I'd like to say your questions are welcome. You can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the chat. And what we'll do is we're going to ask Professor Zhao to give us some insights, and then we're going to ask Aidan to give us his insights. Then we're going to have the inputs from Bruno and Tina, and then we're going to open up for questions. So think about this. There's no questions that we don't want to address. We won't go into the political nature of these things. Some of this is somewhat political. We're not going to do that. We're a business school. But before we start, and before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to get you into the space a little bit by asking you a couple questions of a poll. The first question of the poll is, what is your firm's policy about remote work right now today? Do you not have one? Get back to the office? Is it a hybrid model, 2 to 3 days of home per week, the rest of the time in the office? Is it purely remote work today and into the future? Or work, what's work? Some of us still have to go to work, whether at home or in the garden, like Professor Zhao is. Yeah. So we've got quite a few people answering. Thank you. So as you see, this hybrid model is the way to go. And this purely remote work today and into the future, this is the big game changer we've been seeing. This is the space that we really see firms hiring and even changing their work policies and even their strategy for the workforce going forward, of allowing people to work remotely forever into the future. The hybrid model is new for many institutions. We're seeing the effects on that of what this means. Only 8% have said none, get back to the office. But that's happening as well. We've seen institutions, I think that 8% in my perceptions is that is underrepresented. Work, what's that? A couple of you tongue-in-cheek answered that. Great. Let's go to the next question on the poll. So this goes into also the inputs that we see this, right? Let's go to question 2, Hannah. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much Zoom fatigue do you have? No fatigue is 1, up to, meaning I could do this forever, to 10, I am so sick of Zoom. Where are you? And one of the things that we're observing is that it has a lot to do with personality types. An extrovert either can handle this or is really just dying to get back in the office and see people and touch people and hug people. And some of the introverts, the purest of introverts, can do this forever. Turning off the camera, turning off the mic. So yeah. So what do we see here? 24% say no fatigue at all. That's a lot. That means you've adjusted very, very well into this space. You can do this whether you're in your garden or at your office or in your apartment in Manhattan or Shanghai. 24%. And then a couple of you, we see at the other end of the spectrum, 7s, 8s, and 9s, 12% each. Quite a few of you saying, there is a lot of fatigue here. So we're seeing the spectrum showing up. Let's go to the third question. What is your single biggest challenge regarding the future of work, either for your organization or for yourself? And if you could just answer that in the chat function, that will not be published for everyone to see. What is your single biggest challenge regarding the future of work, regarding your organization and yourself? And as you can answer that in the chat function, and throughout the, I'll come back to this at some point during the day. So that's good insights for this group of people. I think it's we're not any different than all the other big pollings that take place. So thank you very much for those insights. It is my pleasure now to invite Professor Zhao. He's a new professor of management at CEIBS. He's just joining us. In fact, he hasn't even been on campus yet recently because of the travel restraints to get him into China. His primary research interest is on factors that encourage people to become entrepreneurs and succeed, such as self-efficacy, personality, age, team dynamics, and entrepreneurship education. His secondary interest is on leadership styles and ethics. He's joining the team of leadership and OB in our faculty, which is the largest faculty at CEIBS, because we believe that the people side of the business is the biggest part that's of our mandate for helping organizations and individuals grow in that space. He also studies how artificial intelligence changes people's work behavior. So that's very forward-looking. Aidan is with us here from the WEF, as you see with his the background he's got going. He's the project lead for the future of work at the WEF. He's responsible for fulfilling the promise of platform work initiative and supports the Reskilling Revolution initiative together with working with WEF partners to provide better jobs, education, and skills to 1 billion people by 2030. Pretty, it sounds pretty big. Look forward to hearing much. So thanks so much for joining us. And I would like to hand the mic over to Professor Zhao.
This is Zhao, and as Rob has introduced, I'm still in the United States, looking to enter China sometime soon. So I mostly lived in the New York State, and now I'm on a trip in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. So I'm right now in the local library and talking to you. So I want to share with you my experience in recent, about 18 months since the pandemic. So New York State has been a little bit ahead of probably other places in terms of the recovery. We have seen a very strong customer demand, something that I would call overcorrections or revenge consumptions. The government has already announced that they're ending all COVID-related restrictions, like wearing masks in shopping, exercising, in teaching, etc. So local universities plan to return to the regular teaching mode since the summer, and no tele-teaching education anymore. In terms of the customers, we have seen a revenge travel. I'm right now in the revenge travel because my wife said that we haven't brought the kids to a family trip for nearly 2 years. And we have seen the revenge doctor visits. We have seen revenge gym exercising. It means good prospects and good business for some industries that were hit very hard during the pandemic. So those are good news. However, a very interesting phenomenon is that we have seen a very great shortage of labor to fulfill the customer demands. That is largely for two reasons. One is because of the generous unemployment benefits. A lot of workers in the lowly paying industries, they feel that the unemployment benefits actually is higher than their salary before the pandemic. Then why do I bother to go back to work? And the second thing is a change of people's priority in life. Some employees in those higher paying jobs, industries, they believe that now I value my family differently than before the pandemic. So I want to put my family life, my personal hobbies above my job. So they have some reluctancy and hesitations in returning to work. So it's a big problem for the employers. Like a McDonald's restaurant says that we're going to pay people $50 just to show up for interviewing, okay? Not just for accepting jobs, just come for interview because they really need people to work. And some of my favorite restaurants, they still cannot open, not because of the government restrictions or the concerns about the virus, but because they cannot find workers. So a lot of my favorite restaurants, they're still closed or they only open for the dinner, but not for the lunch. And many other companies have struggles finding workers. They're increasing the pay. If you're in the job market this year, it's good news. It's much better than last year, okay? Because the companies are eagerly searching for job candidates and they're increasing the pay. They're asking job candidates, how can we take better care of you? So those are good news. And as Rob just introduced, the biggest challenge brought by the pandemic is probably telework, okay? But I want to point out to Rob that our little survey is probably biased because we are doing that during the work hour in Europe. So only people who actually can afford the time to talk to us, to meet with us would participate in the survey. If you ask all the workforce, probably the percentage of people who say that the companies are starting to disallow telework, the percentage will be higher, okay? So we have been on this mode for 18 months. And in the past few months, most managers, employees, and researchers are seeing the good side of telework. For example, we say that it reduces employees' stress. It's going to save the employers' office rent expenses. However, because the pandemic is easing, there has been different opinions. Some scholars have started to focus on the negative side of telework. For example, we have started to pay attention to the relatively less visibility in the office, how that's going to affect people's chance of getting promotion, and how working separately in different homes will decrease the chance of you observing and learning from your coworkers, because missed learning opportunities will mean little training, informal training, and that's going to influence your human capital. And some other things will include concerns and fears about management's attitude. So recently, JP Morgan boss CEO Jimmy Dimon announced that all his employees will have to come back to office starting in July. Okay, so what does that mean? If the managers are changing their attitudes, so this is Wall Street, this is a financial industry. If the bosses in financial industry and IT industry where telework is possible and which used to be highly encouraged, they are changing their attitudes, then employees may have to follow suit and then come back, returning to work. So what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for the future? I predict that we're going to see a split. So some companies will continue to allow employees to work from home and still probably encourage that. While some other bosses will say, everybody please come back to work. Of course, they still have a little bit flexibility. Everybody by default, you have to come back, but if you file a report, maybe we can allow some hybrid mode. So this is two different approaches. Which side is going to win? We don't know for sure, but fortunately we have competition, we have freedom. So it's going to be decided by employees. They can decide whether they want to join this type of employer or that type of employer. Customers will decide, I would value the service I receive face-to-face through this company, or I don't mind, I want the flexibility of that type of company. And investors, they will decide based on their prediction of the company's potential, which company's stock I'm going to buy. So I think that in the next 3 to 5 years, this is a very interesting field experiment. We're going to see what type of companies, what work schedule will win out through this kind of experiment. So this is some of my observations. Back to you, Robert.
Just as a quick response, I'll throw something at you to be thinking about as Aidan is speaking. So I'm very close, my heart is very close to some manufacturing firms, also Swiss ones. Some are on this call as well, some of the people. It's easy to put HR and some of these IT jobs and things like that at home. But for manufacturing firms, I don't care where you are, you just got to get back to work or the factory is not going to run. So we're talking at a luxury level for some types of industries. They didn't have the luxury of talking about telework at all. 90% of the people of the work creating the value for the firm need to get to the factory. So that's something for manufacturing globally to think about. And then something else I'd like you to think about as we'll come back to the questions, do you see any cultural differences between, say, you mentioned Europe during lunchtime, or the US, or North America, or China, or Asia? Do we see any cultural differences? Something we can think about.
Yes.
I did. I'm going to, yeah, sorry.
From my observation, I see that telework is more popular in the United States and in Europe. And the Chinese bosses in general, they have strong preferences for people showing up in office physically. And China's decisive controls actually is very effective. So Chinese workplace is not disrupted that much. Mm-hmm. At its peak, I estimate that in the United States, above probably 60–70% of all work hours, all work time are online. I think that percent is much lower in China, even if you're working in the IT industry and the financial industry, unless you need to frequently have Zoom meetings with the colleagues in the United States or in Europe. It's a cultural difference. Just the Chinese people prefer closer connections, face-to-face interactions. And fortunately, it's possible in China. It's not possible in many other parts of the world because of the quick spread of the virus.
I'll give you a quick anecdote before I hand it over to Aidan. I work for CEIBS. CEIBS is the leading business school in Asia and in China. In the beginning of the pandemic, we had a group of Chinese executives that came to the school leadership and said, we don't do online learning. Just so you know, we're here to be exposed to great teaching and professors, but also the personal networking is so important that we're gonna tell the school, we'll come back when things are open face to face. We don't want online training. And that's also a difference with the training. And so it's really affected our business models because of this as well. So, but without further ado, let's turn it over to Aidan and hear what you've got to say.
Great, thank you. And thanks very much to CEIBS for the invitation to speak to you today. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Let me just put up the slides. Can you see these okay, Rob? Brilliant. So we see an unprecedented double disruption to work as a result of what we at the forum call the fourth industrial revolution, this wave of technological change that we're currently seeing, which has been accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis. So looking at China, for example, 92% of companies accelerated the digitalization of work processes as a result of the impact of COVID-19. And previous disruptions on this scale have led to fundamental changes in how we work. If you think about the first industrial revolution, it brought people from the fields into the factories. Second industrial revolution created mass production. Third used electronics and IT to automate production and led to a massive displacement of people from into services and knowledge sectors. So it's not unreasonable to expect that the fourth industrial revolution will lead to similarly fundamental and far-reaching changes. You can already see, for example, that looking at China specifically, 82% of companies provided more opportunities to their people to work remotely as a result of the impact of COVID-19, and 50% accelerated the automation of tasks. And what we see is that in response to these changes, forward-thinking companies are designing a new, more people-centric future of work. And the key here is the intentionality. Companies are really thinking hard about how to avoid snapping back into old ways of doing things. One of the things I do at the forum is work with a community of over 100 chief human resource officers from leading multinational companies globally, including many with operations in China. So, you know, a lot of what I'm saying here is coming from our discussions with them. I want to home in on one particular aspect of these disruptions before getting to the kind of changes to how we work more broadly. And this is around skills. So these disruptions are leading to major changes in skills needs. And this is important because it plays into how the workplace of the future is going to function. So with automation, even for people remaining in existing roles, we estimate that some 44% of the skills required will change over the next 5 years, which is a huge proportion. So looking at China, for example, and this chart on the right, more than 40% of workers will require reskilling of over 6 months during that 5-year period. So I mean that's a huge time commitment for companies to try to incorporate. And the skills that are emerging include things like analytical thinking and innovation, active learning and learning strategies, complex problem solving. So, a mix of, very technological focus, but also behavioral skills. So this is going to be a major challenge for companies. How do you incorporate that alongside the day job? And I think it means that opportunities for continuous learning are going to be a key design feature of workplaces going forward. So you get more physical learning spaces, but I think also you'll see much more incorporation of opportunities for online learning into people platforms. So that then brings us to how we see the new future work agenda. And I say new because a lot of this was around already before COVID-19, but I think COVID-19 has really brought some key aspects of it into focus and shifted the narrative slightly. So we see 5 imperatives for organizations as a result of these changes. The first is transforming organization and work design. And this is really the whole agenda around flexibility and agility. And this shift to initially remote work and now what seems to be becoming the norm, hybrid models. So based on data from Mercer globally, 83% of companies say that they're planning to shift to a form of hybrid work where that's possible. It's interesting, that's quite above the 46% that we had in our survey at the top. So maybe not all companies have told their people this yet. So that's the kind of flexibility in terms of place. And obviously there's a big focus on that at the moment with the return to the office. But there's also increased flexibility in terms of time. And maybe this is where the manufacturing workforce that doesn't have that flexibility in terms of place comes into this. So 74% of companies say they're planning to offer increased flexibility in terms of time. And certainly for white collar workers, I think there's a big focus now on asynchronous working. That's going to be a big part of the agenda. The second imperative is aligning technology and skills, as I mentioned, with this emphasis on developing new skills and integrating skills and technology. The third is a new emphasis on companies' responsibility for the well-being of their people. That includes physical, financial, and I think with COVID, really major new emphasis on mental well-being. Also, with the shift to remote work, this has really been a major focus of the Chief Human Resource Officers that we work with throughout the crisis. I think one thing we hear is that Asia is still lagging a bit on breaking this taboo around workplace mental health, but definitely in Europe and the US, you see a huge amount of discussion around that now. So I would expect that to probably change in Asia as well. The fourth imperative is building human-centric leadership. So this idea that with these new ways of working, ways of leading really need to change as well. And we're seeing much more emphasis on empathetic, visible, communicative, empowering leadership. And one big concern, I mentioned companies trying to really intentionally design these new ways of working. One big concern that the CHROs that we work with have is that leaders will be an obstacle to this, particularly the sort of middle management layer of people who are very accustomed to certain ways of doing things. And they are sort of preparing to be quite intentional and proactive about training people in new ways of leading, and also moving out people who aren't able to adapt. And then the fifth element is protecting the workforce ecosystem responsibly. And what we mean by this is very much around redeployment and outplacement. So we think that as a result of these technological changes, 97 million jobs will be created globally over the next 5 years, and 85 million will be destroyed, which is net positive, but probably a bit less net positive than was the case before the COVID crisis. So there's going to be a huge need to support the transitions of people into new roles, and potentially in new companies, and even in new sectors. And research shows that departures have a major impact on the morale of those who remain. So companies, leaning into this and getting it right is going to be a major contributor to the well-being of the people who remain as well. And then cutting across all of this, obviously, is the impact of new technologies, and we think that technology will be critical in enabling all of these aspects of the agenda. So this is quite a broad agenda, of course, but this is what we see companies moving towards, and this is what we're currently working on with our partners. So in conclusion, we think that the future of work is here. I do think, and this pertains to what Professor Zhao was saying as well, I do think there's a risk of some short-term snapback to old ways of doing things. I think we definitely see that with some of the banks in the US at the moment, for example. I do think, as was mentioned as well, that there is a bit of a risk that you get a new inequality emerging around this, with much greater flexibility for knowledge workers, potentially considerably less for manufacturing and some service workers. So that's something that will need attention. But overall, I do think we are looking at greater flexibility, and I think that will be supported by new technologies. So one major concern of hybrid work models is how you maintain a kind of balance between the people who aren't in the office and the people who are. And no one's really found a solution to that yet, but potentially virtual reality offers a solution to that sort of a few years down the line, where you can really create a level playing field for everybody wherever they're working from. So that's an example of how new technologies can continue to shift the narrative. New skills, I think people have already adapted massively to how to work remotely during the COVID crisis. I suspect they'll probably adapt equally successfully to hybrid working as well. New ways of leading, as I mentioned, I think will be a huge part of this, managers and leaders adapting. Social pressure, as Professor Zhao mentioned, the competition for talent is really hotting up. And it does seem from surveys that companies who offer flexibility will have an advantage there. And also investor pressure. So over the past year, the mention of the kind of S component, the people component of ESG has really spiked in earnings calls. You think, for example, about the collapse or the poor performance of the Deliveroo IPO in the UK, one of the platform companies similar to Didi in China. This is really now how companies treat their people is becoming a major focus area for investors. So companies are going to come under scrutiny and pressure over this. And I think there'll be more. One trend will be for more reporting and more metrics around human capital. So, in conclusion, we think this is a huge opportunity for business leaders to help shape a better new world of work. We do think that is what will emerge from the COVID crisis.
There's a ton of information there. We could spend hours just talking on each of these different points. I find your observations of the S growing very telling in this that investors, there's going to be a momentum towards this coming from the investor side. Very, very interesting future. And I think, we're just at the beginning of this, but I think that is going to be something quite interesting going forth. And so that's the exact flip side of just snapping back to old ways, right? Bruno Casemiro is on the call with us. He's, as I mentioned, he's in leadership development, responsible for leadership development programs at UBS, a big, known as conservative big bank, the largest wealth manager in the world with a massive footprint. We work closely with Bruno and his team on different things over the years. Bruno, what are your insights and reflections and reactions to Aidan and Professor Zhao?
So thanks everyone for having me here. Good to see you, Rob, and nice to meet you, Aidan, and Professor Zhao as well. I agree with everything you have said. I think from a UBS standpoint, actually, we responded really quickly and really well. The investment we made in infrastructure and IT infrastructure over the years was then tested, and it was really optimal. I think here the positive is that the numbers showed for itself with this quick reaction where we had to have lockdown, work from home. At one point, 90% of our workforce was working remotely globally, which was a phenomenon in our view. But I think what's interesting that comes out of it, it allows this to push forward something that we already had as a priority as digital disruption. So we already had a mandate to transform. We already being disrupted by fintechs. And we felt a little bit of the heat, but then COVID came and really accelerated this path of transformation, which in my role gave us a platform to say, instead of pausing everything that we normally did face-to-face, how about we now run a pilot and see who would like to join us in this virtual setup? And the appetite was actually great. Despite many things happening in the organizational level, the appetite is great. And it was just the perfect timing to positioning the importance of innovation, of digital disruption. Because then our business leaders really have the context of this is happening. And I feel more important than ever, they felt the rush to do something different. And the outcome has been really great, not only from a numbers perspective, also from a cultural perspective. What I felt was, as Rob mentioned, we are quite a hierarchical, quite a well-structured organization, as normally banks are, but we listen to the data and we listen to our people. So we actually now have a mandate from the jobs and the platforms that we have. Whoever wants to work from home will work from home. This will help us a lot with the real estate footprint as well, which we have quite heavily in Switzerland. But more importantly, what I've noticed was this virtual setup helped us break silos. We were quicker to act, quicker to connect with our colleagues. We felt more accountability. I felt that was less space for micromanagement, and the response time was a lot quicker. So it allows us to innovate. It allows us to grow. It allows us to connect and break even the divisional silos that normally sometimes physical walls can set up. And this virtual setup just allowed us to operate in a very different way. And the good thing is that the business recognized that and asked us, out of this COVID experience, what are the 1, 2, or 3 things that you would like to keep? And the flexibility, arrangement, and the working from home was definitely number 1. And I have heard even from business leaders that had a very busy schedule. As you know, bankers like to also to work hard, and we have to serve multiple clients in global regions. They started to connect with their families in different ways. And I heard our colleagues to say, actually, I now really enjoy having breakfast with my children. This is now something I don't want to give back again. And this impacts on how I come up and show up at work. So there's a lot of lessons to taken out of this. I see it as a great experience and benefit. Of course, we had to now focus also on health and well-being. I think this is one of the topics that has to be a priority, because I also realized a lot of my colleagues were not used to work from home. I had the privilege of running my own business a few years ago, working from home, so I was okay. But I see that a lot of colleagues do a lot more hours working from home. They almost feel guilty if they have to go and get a glass of water in the kitchen and come back to the desk. And I think this is where we really have to show, guys, you have to find your own balance. But I'm excited about the future of work. And you know, don't get me wrong, I've worked in finance for 14 years. It is normal that some banks, and I worked for JP Morgan, for example, that some banks, we will try to get back some control over on what they are used to. But what I feel, and I think Aidan mentioned this quite well, is that talent now has a choice.
Yep.
And they will choose flexibility. If we don't open that flexibility, they will go elsewhere. And I think in a matter of months, years, we will see that happening. But yeah, overall, a great experience from my side and UBS here as well.
Thanks, Bruno. Tina, I'm going to ask you also, welcome. I'm going to ask you a specific question, as you're based in Shanghai and have gone through a different experience than most of us being in the West. The gap was much faster or slower or shorter than it was in the US or than it was in Europe. You have a different experience. And this comment about snapping back to old ways. And we know, it's been proven that one of the Asian, particularly Chinese managerial styles is to be authoritative and directive. And it's maybe a little bit more, it's a cliche, but I think there's facts that prove this. And that a more European or Western style of leading is more participative than directive. What have you observed here in Shanghai about these two aspects, snapping back and recovering and change and the leadership?
Yes, thank you for inviting, first of all. And I think it's an interesting topic because I introduced my company. Actually, it's a French company and called Pfab. And I will say it's a French version type of Johnson & Johnson. And like you mentioned, the Chinese managerial style, actually, as HR, we support two business units, both cosmetics business unit and also pharmaceutical. So they are leading by two different Asian leaders. One is Korean lady, another one is a Singaporean. So I would say in the end, actually the Asian managerial style, they are very much the same. So, but they are, one is based in China, in Shanghai. Actually, she didn't get the chance to go back to Korea during the, since the outbreak of COVID-19, that's normal. And on the contrary, the other GM actually, who is a Singaporean, and he has been based in Singapore since the outbreak of COVID-19, meaning that he hasn't got any chance to get back to China yet, even though the whole team are based in China. Oh, so yeah, so how do we work? If we go back to the old ways of working, of course, it's not going to work. And I will say I join very much the 5 imperatives that was introduced by Aidan. If we talk about the transformation of our organization during the COVID-19, we were actually on the one side, we are retail business. We are selling the brand like Aidan, it's a skincare. So we have more than 1,500 beauty advisors around China in different cities. And when everything is locked down, actually, of course, it's unable for us to do any business. Then we have to go for very agile transformation in terms of organization. So what we have done, we have changed our training team, first of all, who is the coach of our beauty advisor, from an offline coach to be an online live streamer. Why? Because their training has to be done only via some online tools. We use all the tools that we can use, like Teams of Microsoft and Zoom, of course, also WeChat Work or Tencent meetings, all the meetings which allow us to do this agile reorganization in terms of the work arrangement, we have to use that. So that is one example. And I use example of the pharmaceutical team with a GM who has been always remote managed. So actually, I agree with you, the participative management style, probably it's a stereotype that more happens in the Western world. But then actually, in the case that I just mentioned, it works very well. And if I talk about the results of the business unit, actually, they reached the yearly targets already by the end of November. So meaning that by working very closely, the meetings actually starting could be from 8 a.m. in the morning to 11 p.m. sometimes. Then I will go back to another topic, probably mentioned also by Aidan, benefits. We have to think about from the very human-centric point of view. And we probably work much more than in working in the old ways, because if we are physically in the office, we normally start at from 9 a.m. and then we end at 6 p.m. But if we work via internet, actually, it could be non-stop.
Yeah.
So yeah, and yeah, I hope I replied to your first question. And the second question, actually, can you remind me again?
Well, it had to do with the idea about the authority, the snapback to old ways, one. Yep. Two, and the other was really about this idea about the authoritative leadership style versus the West. So yeah.
I think
yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I replied a little bit comprehensively in the examples that I was given. Yeah. So if I may add to the last point, I would like to share. Actually, we had some discussion with our CEO, CHRO. Instead of promoting the remote working, actually we get back a little bit to think about what I just mentioned. Whether we are a little bit overworking under the new way. So in terms of, from the perspective of HR, how we can guide the team and guide the management to better organize, and we support with different benefits. For example, 1 day per week work from home in China, whether it's feasible. However, in our French headquarters, it's already everywhere. So we had the big discussion, self-discipline and overworkload, those kinds of topics are still ongoing actually. Yeah.
So I have a question. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. I'd like to launch it into a Q&A now, if we can. And to the participants who are watching in, again, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom to ask more questions as we go. I know I've done this quite a few times. I'm afraid that we're going to run out of time from the questions, but I would like to ask again, and we go back to China and we see that China's time out and time at home was different than it was in the rest of the world. They were recovered much differently. We also see the new figures coming out of China from Q2 growth rates. Wow, absolutely phenomenal growth rates. So this mentality of, you know, we all work when there's work to do. If there's a boom time, we're going to work. And I'd like to ask the question though about how the pandemic might change China's connection with the world economy in the next several years, in the next 5 years, because we said, 1 year out and 5 years out. Where are we going to be 5 years out? Where's China going to be? Everyone's saying the growth is just, the engine of growth continues. What are your views on this, Professor?
Oh, hi. Yes, we need to first look at what was happening before the pandemic. We see that there has been great pressure to disengage China from the global economy, for example, the world war, the trade war. And then the pandemic came. It was a big concern initially. However, it turns out that China's manufacturing capabilities and its export was even actually stronger during the pandemic. For example, the whole world still need computers. Okay, they still need construction materials, sports equipment. So those things were not affected. Actually, the export from China to the rest of the world has increased. And because China's manufacturing capabilities were not disrupted that much during the pandemic, when no other countries can produce those things, China still can. So China proved to be a very reliable partner to many other countries in the world through this pandemic. So there's something that's very positive. There is a concern though, because China still cannot open its border. Recently, Wall Street Journal reported a rumor that China will continue to close its border until the second half of 2022, which means that's another year. And who knows, maybe it's going to be even longer than that. Because of the personnel flow is restricted, that means that no students, no travelers, no conference attendees from foreign countries can visit China. So that's going to significantly influence employees, employers in those industries.
Sure.
So for those sectors, unfortunately, it's going to be a very long way, and they are a very important part of China as well. So if China's immunization rate can increase, can go up in the next year or two, then China, I think, will be fine, intermingling with other parts of the world. When other parts of the world are returning to normalcy, China will face a lot of pressure, and hopefully the government and the people will make it happen so that the concern over the virus will no longer be that severe.
Thanks. That's interesting. I'm going to keep moving through the questions kind of rapidly if I can. One of the questions that came up was, what impact will this shift to remote work and hybrid work have on workforce location and the legal implications of this? On the one hand, if I look to some of these firms, the world is now their oyster. They can literally go to the world to hire people rather than a particular geographical metropolitan area because that's where we have our hub, this or that. How is this shift going to impact us 5 years out? What do you think, Aidan? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's going to have major impacts that probably haven't fully been appreciated yet. There was a statistic in our future jobs survey on this. So 38% of companies expect to change the locations they operate in the next 5 years as a result of the pandemic. And one big trend is going to be a move away from large offices on prime city center real estate. One trend we've been hearing about recently is moving to more of a kind of hub and spokes model. So you have more local office spaces to enable a bit of the greater flexibility, making it easier for people to come into office space for collaboration, but continue to work at home for more focused tasks. This whole big question there obviously is still this: how do you handle the kind of equality of opportunity angle of certain people having more face time in the head office? And then I think as the second point, as you mentioned, we are going to see a new surge in cross-border remote work because companies will rapidly realize that these tasks that are now being performed fully remotely can actually be just outsourced to people who are willing to perform them probably a lot more cheaply in other regions of the world. So I think those will probably be the two big shifts that we see as a result of this.
A positive, negative, in reaction to this, a positive, negative shift could be the following mentality for some firms. Employers are a huge expense, fixed cost mentality. Let's outsource everything. In fact, one organization that I have been involved with, they had a discussion ongoing at one point to say, this was pre-COVID even, to say, in the future, maybe this company is only a brokerage for work and for tasks. We don't need any employees, theoretically. We sub everything out, and that reduces, our commitment, our flexibility, and, but there are limits to this, right? And how it affects on culture. Any thoughts on this?
I'm happy to give a thought on this, and I do think that we're going to see increased use of contracting models, definitely. Whether it would go so far as, in most cases, that model of just having a kind of core of strategy and HR people. I think one sort of blocker there is that I think we are actually going to see a lot more regulation around contractors and in particular the platform economy. Because one thing the pandemic did really reveal was the lack of safety nets and predictability in those forms of work. And I think that's really put a lot more emphasis. We're seeing major regulatory initiatives in both Europe and the US at the moment around platform work. I think that will extend to self-employment as well. So the kind of cost savings that companies can achieve by that kind of outsourcing might actually be less in the future than is currently the case.
Well, the management of that. And there's another thing, as you mentioned through your figures, Aidan, there's a net gain in jobs, a net gain, we hope, but there's also going to be the displacement of a lot of jobs. I'm close to another organization here in Switzerland. They've said that 30% of their entire workforce is going to be retiring by 2030. If that's not a declaration of war on talent, I don't know what is. They're desperate to get people to work for them. And so they're forced into, and this is every firm, they're forced into this, whether they like it or not. They have to come up with new models of work, new flexible models. There are other studies that have said, if I'm not allowed to work at home, there's like X% of chance I'm going to quit because I'm now used to this and I demand this, and the millennials demanding it anyway. Any comments on this, Professor?
Yes, I think that companies really needs to become more flexible, and despite all the concerns, it turns out that the remote work, the flexibility actually works. And there has been an interesting study I read that the researcher surveyed many employees, and they find out that 70% employees reported that actually they multitask during video conferences. And initially I said that, wow, 70%, that's huge. But then I thought that I have different opinions. So that just 70%? Okay, maybe that should be 90%, 95%. But so what? So maybe one of the advantage of remote work is that people can do things that are still related to work, and actually they can make better use of their time, And during traditional mode of work, you still have to waste your time here and there and doing small talks, driving back to work or to the work, etc. So not every minute of the work hour is spent on work. So take it naturally. There will be downside of remote work. There will be downside of traditional type of work. But overall speaking, you need to consult employees, listen to employees' concerns, and offer some solutions, offer flexibilities in order to retain, to attract talents, and hopefully make better use of their talents.
It's interesting you bring that up. One of the comments that we've asked participants to look into, I asked, what is your single biggest challenge regarding the future of work for your organization or for yourself? And I won't quote the name, but one person wrote, for me, adapting again to office work, going back, because I personally feel uncomfortable due to COVID measures and I'm still working with a mask, and very unproductive times being in the office. She mentions the commuting time, chatting in the office, useless meetings. However, the old management style has said, come back anyway, right? So, and I think that there is personality here too, right? What this person may say is very unproductive might be the reason why another person really wants to go back to work, right? So it's, I think we're going to have a very differentiated view 5 years out on this. I'm going to give, going back to this other question about what's the biggest challenge. There's another one that came up. I'll read it to you. It says, one participant said, trust building with limited face-to-face meetings. So, you've heard these many stories, people joining organizations that have been there a year and never met anyone face-to-face. Even the onboarding is difficult and the working together. How do you build trust when you can never have face-to-face meetings? Any experience with this?
I think it's in what we've been doing is really to think about, it's finding the blend between when do we communicate and how often we do, so we don't lose touch, because indeed, I agree with you, if we are in physical presence, there's a stronger link. But maybe virtual, it means we catch up more regularly, and we can even talk about more, less meaningful things, and we get to know each other on a different level because we connected more than if you were face to face, where your time sometimes is restricted. That's something that I faced. But for example, talking about meaningful experience, our own team hosted a virtual Christmas party. And I can tell you today it was the best Christmas party we've had. We brought our families to the cameras. We all saw each other. We all saw each other put our kids to bed, and we stayed until quite late hours of the night. And I thought, wow, how powerful was that? I thought always being in presence, but the setup, how we arranged it, how we made it a team effort, one cooked, one did something else. We really managed to really connect and bring other people in. So the scalability element of virtual, it can really help sometimes. So I think it's how do we find an advantage with the virtual, and how do we learn how to connect even deeper. But I don't think we should stop seeing our clients face to face, but we just might have to prioritize when it's really key and important.
Thanks for that. We're running out of time. Again, we could spend, this is a sampler just to bring the topic back to the table. There's lots of things going on. One of the things that I keep thinking about is, again, the legal implications of this. How do we make this work legally when we've got staff in 12 different countries where we don't even have legal entities? And how is that supposed to work from tax perspectives and things? And this is a real situation that even affects us in our office. Many firms are challenged with this. It's something I'm seeing very little being talked about. Maybe it's just happening behind the scenes, but I know a lot of firms are trying to make this, scrambling to make this work. Plus all the emotional part. How do I go back to work? When do I go back to work? What does that mean now for my family and for me? Aidan, famous last words from your side and advice when firms are thinking about the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think just recognize that the current period, the next 6 months to a year in particular, is a huge opportunity to fundamentally rethink the way we do things, and to make sure that the policies and practices that are put in place are people friendly and really kind of support productivity, but also support well-being. And I do think those changes will come. I think it might not be a kind of smooth process, but I do think we're going to get there.
Thanks, Aidan. How? Any last thoughts?
Yes, actually, the trend of telework started before the pandemic. Just the pandemic increased its trend, just like roller coaster. So initially it's like this, and then it goes up quickly like this. And then once the pandemic is eased, I estimate it's going to come back down. Okay, some people are tired of it, so there might be overcorrections. It might crash even lower than before the pandemic level, but because it proved telework, it works. Yeah. So it's going to resume climbing up. So it's going to go like this. So it's my prediction of the trend of telework.
Thanks. What we typically do is we've got a whole bunch of host more questions that people have asked that we haven't had time to go into, but I'm respectful of time, of your time, the speakers, and also of the participants. We'll send you some of these questions and ask you to answer 2 or 3 of them in a short way, or like Aidan did before, creating a link to something that might answer the question on the behalf. I'd like to say a huge thanks to Professor Zhao and welcome to CEIBS. Look forward to seeing you on the Shanghai campus soon. To Aidan, thank you so much. To Bruno and to Tina, thank you very much for sharing with us. And I'd like to also say thanks to the China Baden-Württemberg network, who partnered with us in the background to help market this. I wish all of you a great afternoon full of purpose and well-being and balance between work, home, and life. And get back to work, everyone.